And here we go. You should all see something on your screen that looks like this, right?
Yes, we do.
Am I right? Good. I'm glad to hear it. Okay. It does fill your screen. So if you want to try and compress it a little bit to get the image of people out of the way, you can do that as well. Up to you. The Galapagos Islands, why am I talking about those? Well, because it's one of those places that is absolutely magical. And I assume that some of you have had the pleasure of being on the Galapagos Islands, but probably the majority of you haven't. It is further to get to than Maine, but it is really worth going to for reasons I hope to make clear. Now, let's see if we can move along. When I was a kid in 1960, I was a 16-year-old kid. My parents presented me with this fantastic book called The Wonders of Life on Earth. And that contained a lot of information about evolution, about Charles Darwin. It was really a pioneering effort by Life magazine. And one of the most iconic pictures in it was a fold-out picture showing this, what looked like an antediluvian scene of all these dragon-like creatures that are the marine iguanas, and bright red crabs, and a volcano in the background, and frigate birds. And this is the Galapagos. And I just knew I had to get there. I had to figure out some way I could get there. Well, I managed that, and I wrote a book about the Galapagos in 2002, and then I revised that book slightly and got a different publisher, Princeton University Press, for 2006. And that's where it stood. And the book was fairly popular because it did something that other books don't do. And that is that it didn't just describe the marine iguana, it talked about the life cycle. It didn't just describe the Galapagos penguin, it talked about the life cycle and how to find it and where to find it. It was a real natural history. And then I teamed up with a photographer named Kevin Lachlan, who runs wildlife nature tours. Some of you may have even done a wildlife nature tour. And he is a great photographer. I ain't bad at it myself, and all the photos you're going to see tonight are mine. But Kevin offered to illustrate a new edition of the book, which would be brought up to date in 2022. Now, why does it need to be brought up to date? Marine iguanas haven't really changed that much. Well, maybe not, but maybe so. There's been a revolution in taxonomy, not only of birds, but in many other things as well. And so that's what really needed updating. And there's Kevin Lachlan, the man in the middle. Hard to believe, but Kevin has now led over 40 trips to the Galapagos Islands. I don't know of anybody who knows the islands as well as Kevin, and he had a huge range of photos that we could use for our book. So the new book was published in November of 2022, and that is the origin of this talk tonight. Now, the Galapagos Islands, as maybe some of you know, maybe most of you know, is an archipelago located about 600 miles west of Ecuador, and the Galapagos Islands are part of Ecuador. This is what they look like, and this is important. If it were one island, but this isn't one island. This is an archipelago, an array of islands that are close together. That matters. The youngest islands are the ones on the far western side of the archipelago. The oldest islands are the ones that are on the eastern side. So the Galapagos Islands are not the same age. The oldest ones are something in the neighborhood of several million years old. The youngest one's much younger than that. The youngest island is Fernandina, which is less than 1 million years old. The oldest island is Española, which is about 3.2 million years old, except it isn't. I will show you why in a moment. The maps of the Galapagos show the different points where one lands. If you've never been there and you want to go, it's just what happens is you are not dropped on an island. You go from island to island to island to island. And the more you spend for the cruise, the more islands you go to. Don't get the impression you can go to one island and see all the animals and plants of the Galapagos. Not possible. The Galapagos is an active archipelago, volcanic in origin, 100% volcanic in origin. And recently, Vulcan Wolf, which is on the western side, northernmost island, and Isabella, erupted, and rivers of lava flowed down. No one was injured. The Galapagos are not heavily populated. There's only one place really that is. And so part of the great interest in the island is the fact that it's geologically interesting, something that very much got Darwin's interest. Galapagos have kind of a complicated history. I wish we had time to go into it, but we don't. But in some of the books, you'll see these are the names of the islands. For instance, Indefatigable, Albemarle, Narborough. Who else but the British could invent those kinds of names? And those were the names given to the islands because of British explorers. And many, the Galapagos were a very popular spot for whalers to go to. Abundance of sperm whales could be found in the oceans around there, and plenty of provisioning in the Galapagos. So the Galapagos have always had sort of two names per island. There's Albemarle in the middle, and the Spanish name for that is Isabella. And this is an old diagram. It's not the most popular name. It is the name. This is Ecuador. And so the names you see in blue are the official names of the islands. And that's what you see on all the maps. And that's what you should call them. There's no such thing as Indefatigable anymore. It's Santa Cruz. These are volcanic islands, and you can see it as soon as you get there. When Charles Darwin first visited the islands, he was not impressed. He was kind of depressed. He had been 4 years on the voyage of the Beagle. He wanted to go home, and this is where they took him, to a place that looked like this. It almost looks like Mars, and if you have a computer that you can play around with color-wise, you can turn it into Mars. But that's the island of Bartolome. The Galapagos is known today to most people who read anything about biology as the place where a man named Charles Darwin discovered a group of birds that eventually came to bear his name collectively, the Darwin's finches. That's an oversimplified account of it, but fundamentally, Darwin and the finches will forever be associated together with the Galapagos Islands. Darwin was an elderly man when he wrote about evolution, but he became an evolutionist when he was still a young man. Now here you see a little painting of him sitting on the Galapagos Island. The young philosopher visits the islands, but the thing of it is he did not have any epiphany about evolution on the Galapagos Islands. He was there to collect information, to collect data, to collect specimens, and he happened to see one thing which really struck his fancy and added to a great many other observations he had made on this long 5-year voyage of the Beagle that was soon going to come to an end after he left the Galapagos. Today, the Galapagos still celebrates Darwin. He's on the currency, and the tortoises are also on the currency. There is even an 1835 coffee, and the significance of that is 1835 was the year when Charles Darwin came to the Galapagos. The insignificance of it is they forgot he was British and probably always drank tea and hardly ever drank coffee, but who knows. When Darwin was on the Galapagos, he was in his late 20s. He was physically fit. He was a young, healthy, tall man who could ride horseback as well as anybody, who could collect specimens, who was tireless, and not at all the figure that many people associate him with when he was elderly with the long beard and the very big brow ridges. This is what he looked like not long after he got back from the Galapagos. The woman next to him is his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, whom he married. It was a very successful marriage. This is Valentine's Day, so let's, acknowledge the happy marriage of the Darwins. They had 10 children and loved them all. This is the HMS Beagle. You don't want to be on this boat. The modern craft are much more comfortable, I guarantee you. But I made this model when I was a kid. This is the Revell Plastics Company model of the Beagle. The ship made famous by Charles Darwin. If I do say so myself, I did a credible job on it. But it made Darwin seasick pretty much the whole time he was on it. Now, September 15th, 1835, big day in the history of the biological world, because that was the day Charles Darwin set foot on the Galapagos Islands. He was there for about 4 weeks and visited the sum total of 4 islands. They were large islands, but only 4. And so today, if you go to the Galapagos or have been, the chances are darn good you will see more of the islands than Darwin actually did. Nonetheless, he made a lot with what he saw, and he was actually there longer than you would be because he was there for about a month. It's not hard to get to the Galapagos. There are any number of tours that go there, and you fly into Ecuador, fly out to the Galapagos. And this is the National Geographic ship. 250,000 tourists, maybe more, visit the Galapagos annually. That took a big dip, obviously, during the pandemic. More about that later. This is the more typical yacht that you see in the Galapagos. Holds about 12 people very comfortably, 12 to 15. Most of you don't stay in a hotel when you're on the Galapagos. You stay on a boat, a nice yacht, and you move from island to island, usually late afternoon or overnight. And then there are various landing sites on islands which you visit. The man on the left, it works for the National Park Service in the Galapagos, and he is an official guide. Every group to the Galapagos has a guide, and every group listens to that guide and does what the guide tells them. The Galapagos is one of the most protected spots on the planet. You cannot wander around. You cannot pick up shells. You cannot stick volcanic rock in your pockets for your rock collection. You have to stay with a guide, and if you're smart, you'll listen to the guide, because these folks, men and women, are very, very smart, and they'll teach you a great deal about the islands. You move onto the islands and off the islands by these inflatable boats, which many people would call zodiacs or something like that, but there's a universal name for it on the Galapagos, which is panga. All of these inflatable boats are pangas, and you have to be a little careful getting in and out of them. If you have difficulty walking, Galapagos can be a challenge, because not all the trails are good, and not all the landings are particularly easy. Can be slippery, and you have to step over sea lions and seals and things like that. Anyway, this is Academy Bay at Puerto Ayora, Santa Cruz, and this is the largest settlement of humans on the Galapagos, Academy Bay. It looks like any normal town in Ecuador, a thriving little community, and a mile from it is the Charles Darwin Research Station, which has done heroic work in conservation of tortoises and of iguanas. It's a haven for the finches. If you go there, you'll see any number of the Darwin's finches. And add to that the Galapagos Conservancy, something I very strongly support, that also does research on the of a conservation focused nature on the Galapagos. So Ecuador does a very good job of doing what has to be done. Let me be blunt. The animals on the Galapagos will forever require the care of humans. If we don't do it, there'll be so many invasive species that the native animals, the endemic animals that bring people there, are going to have serious problems. Some people have said there are too many people that visit the islands, and maybe we should give them a break and have periods when no tourism is allowed in the Galapagos Islands. Let them recover a little bit. This is what happened during the pandemic. Ecuador had to close during the pandemic, had to close access to the Galapagos. There were no tours. Nobody went. Nobody set foot on the islands. But they sure did set foot on the sea. The Chinese fishing fleet came in. And if you look at that map, you see the Galapagos has a protected marine reserve. The Chinese fishing fleet came in to the very edge of that reserve and just fished their little hearts out. And something else that happened then too, reported by the government of Ecuador, is they turned off their transponders. So they weren't broadcasting their geographic position anymore. And so the feeling is very strong that the Chinese fishing fleet encroached into the protected zone. If these fish are over harvested, the beginning of the collapse of the seabirds of the Galapagos will have started. And so that's what happened when the islands had to shut down for the pandemic. That was a brief shutdown, and the islands are up and running again, and you don't see sites like this. By the way, if you want any more evidence about this, this is what was found just off the Galapagos Islands after the Chinese fishing fleet left. That. A sea full of plastic bottles, one of the worst things you can possibly do to the ocean. How do we know these are from the Chinese fishing fleet? If you read the labels, and there are photographs, close-ups of the labels, they're all in Chinese characters. So the Galapagos is a tourist spot where it's a mutualism between tourist visitation and the organisms that the visitors are there to see. As long as there is tourism, the Galapagos will be protected. It is in Ecuador's best interest to do so, and they seem to really like it. You land in this airport, which is on the little island of Baltra. That's one of the places you can land. The other's on the island of Santa Cruz. And it doesn't look like much when you first get there. That's what Darwin thought too. But pretty soon you start to see things like this. And boy, does that make it worth it. This is Bartolome. You have to walk up a lot of steps. That's Pinnacle Rock down there, the thing that's pointing up like an arrowhead. And you look out on these volcanic mountains. It's really quite amazing. You go from island to island, visiting different areas of recent volcanism and not so recent volcanism. The Galapagos are located on the equator. It's an equitable environment, but you don't get many things that grow out of this kind of lava flow, but some do. This is one of the endemic species, Brachycereus, the lava cactus. Heavens knows how it manages to get itself rooted, but it does. And so when you walk, it feels like you're walking over molten metal. It almost feels like metal when you're walking over that rock. And the kinds of volcanoes that are on the Galapagos, a lot of them are these shield volcanoes, not all, but this is volcano Cumbra, one of the most recent volcanoes. It's on the westernmost island of Fernandina, and it's still active. And you can see these lava flows from a place called Punta Espinosa, which is one of the landing areas with many marine iguanas. And all of those flowed down during the points when the volcano was active. This is Punta Espinosa looking in the opposite direction, looking out at the Pacific Ocean. This is just north of the equator. The equator cuts through the Galapagos Islands. And there you can see some sea dragons, the marine iguanas. One of the first things Charles Darwin saw was Kicker Rock, because the first place they landed was what's now San Cristobal, and was Chatham Island when he landed. And this is Kicker Rock, one of the just characteristic landmark rocks there. And there are seabirds nesting on that. The look of the Galapagos is arid because most of the islands are arid. They're on the equator. They don't get enough rainfall to support lush forest unless they get rainfall and mist and clouds. And so those only occur at higher elevations, as you'll see. But the lower elevations have these tree-sized cactuses, really quite striking. They're found nowhere else in the world. And the land iguanas wander around on them. They also have this carpet weed, Sesuvium, which land iguanas love to munch. And so you can wander the islands, but I show you that picture for a reason. Those folks are on a trail. They dare not leave the trail. Nobody leaves the trail. That is a no-no, and they stay together. You don't string out because your guide is telling you about the significance of what you're seeing. And yes, photographers can take their pictures, but no, they can't take their cell phones and wander out across the Sesuvium to get a little bit closer to whatever they want to get close to. When you look at some of the beaches, they look like regular beaches, but what are those black things? Well, those are little remnants of volcanic rock, because everywhere you go, these are volcanic islands. On the southeasternmost island of Hispaniola, really dramatic cliffs full of seabirds and a blowhole to boot. This is really dramatic when this thing blows up. That's water, of course, coming up from a compressed hole in the ground when the waves come in. The cliffs of Genovesa, and if you're a bird watcher, and I suspect this audience is full of them, and you plan a trip to the Galapagos, go to Genovesa. It used to be called Tower Island. If you've ever heard of Roger Torrey Peterson, this was his favorite island on the Galapagos. The popular nickname for Genovesa is Bird Island because of the colonies of birds that are there. So you really want to get on a trip that goes to Genovesa. If it's not, then you can see that this is not so easy because Genovesa is all the way up in the northeastern section of the Galapagos. Nonetheless, there are many cruises that go there. Notice the islands are dominated by dry lowlands. There's a transition zone that's relatively narrow, and then small parts of the Galapagos on the major islands like Santa Cruz and San Cristobal, and a little bit on Santiago, and of course on Isabela, the largest island. Those are the humid highlands, and so that's what gives the environmental diversity. The Galapagos has never been part of the mainland. Those islands were never connected to the mainland. And to the east, the mainland is South America. The oval red circle is the Galapagos archipelago, and they sit on the Nazca plate. If you're at all familiar with the geology of the Earth, plate tectonics, the various plates of the Earth move in different directions, often in tension zones against one another. Hence, earthquakes in places like, well, Turkey, and also along the so-called Ring of Fire in the Pacific, going up from the mountains of southern South America, up all the way past Alaska and down to Japan. That's the Ring of Fire where the plates are hitting against one another. Galapagos are on the Nazca plate, moving in the direction you see by the arrows. This is how the Galapagos formed from a hot spot in the sea, pushes up magna, and this comes above the surface, forms an island. There is no life on that island initially, and thus all of the life on the Galapagos had to get there. It had to get there by immigrating from a mainland location. And once it got there, it began to evolve, and it got there in a way that it could evolve in a very complex manner because it's not just one island, it's a series of islands. The Nazca plate is moving, as you see from the yellow arrows. And so initially, when an island is formed, it's extremely active. I told you that things like Vulcan Lacumbra and Fernandina, Vulcan Wolf on Isabela are still very active. But as the islands move, that activity subsides. And eventually the islands actually can go below the ocean, and old Galapagos islands have now completely subsided below the oceans, flat-topped islands, and eventually the Nazca Plate subducts under the South American plate. So it's a really interesting dynamic of the Earth. It's also a complex current system in the Galapagos, which is important because there are both warm and cold currents. Now, if you look in the middle of the diagram, you can see that warm currents flow from the South American mainland and from parts of Central America toward the archipelago, and cold water deep currents come from the Pacific Ocean. The cold water currents cause upwelling and really raise the nutrient level in the water around the Galapagos. That's why the fishing is so good, and that's why there are a lot of seabirds in the Galapagos. There are cold waters also coming up, the Peruvian current coming up from along the coast of South America, and for years it's been known how they upwell also. And so this is a highly productive area of the ocean, and that is one of the reasons why you have the organisms doing so well under normal circumstances in the Galapagos. A quick tour of what the islands look like. There are a few places where it gets very foggy. It's called a Garua fog, and that's what keeps the highlands nice and moist, but the lowlands are dominated by a completely different group of species of plants. These are Palo Santo trees, and those are flamingos in the foreground. This is a hypersaline lagoon. Here are your Palo Santo trees. Darwin hated them. He didn't like the smell of them. They do have an incense type smell, but these are greatly abundant in the more lowlands of the island. So they give you a sense of what the islands look like. I mentioned history. There's a place on Floriana Island, formerly known as Charles Island, where there's an old barrel, and this barrel has been maintained over the years. Tourists love it. You put in a letter to somebody like, your grandparents or somebody like that, and you don't put a stamp on it, but you put your address in there. And maybe you're from New Jersey and they live in Massachusetts, so you put their little card for them. And the idea is that another tourist will reach in there, look through them, say, "Oh, hey, I live in Haverhill, and here's a card for somebody who lives nearby." So you don't take it and mail it; you actually bring it to them, to their house, and you knock on the door and you introduce yourself and you say, "I'm delivering this from the Galapagos Islands," and some people actually do that. Whaling was a big deal at the Galapagos. Wish I had time to talk about it, but Herman Melville visited the islands. That was one of the things he did during his research for Moby Dick. So there is the famous barrel at Post Office Bay on what used to be Charles Island. There are these flat islands that have bird colonies on them. This is North Seymour. Not a lot of people get to go there, but if you do, that's one of the places to see a colony of magnificent frigate birds. Most of the frigate birds that you see on the Galapagos are great frigate birds. They have two species that nest there. Mangrove islands, like these red mangroves, surround the Galapagos. Great place to see sea turtles, sharks, fish. And then up in the highlands, it starts to get green. This is the highlands of Santa Cruz. These are Palo Santo trees. Not Palo Santo trees, these are Scalesia trees, and they're often called tree daisies because they're related to the composites, to the daisies. One of the most successful species of birds, you probably were wondering, is he going to show us a bird? Well, there's one. That's not a yellow warbler. That's now officially called a mangrove warbler. It used to be a subspecies of yellow warbler, but at least on the IOC checklist that we use in our book, it's now split out as a separate species, the mangrove warbler, and it's a Galapagos subspecies of mangrove warbler. This is a mangrove warbler sitting on the dome of a tortoise. Mangrove warblers can be found in the highlands. They can be found in the midlands. They can be found in the lowlands. They can be found on the beaches. They are examples of what ecologists call ecological release. They have no competitors, and so they go everywhere. Uh, there are wild tortoises that you can see. You can't see any of the so-called saddle-shelled tortoises. They're not abundant enough to make it to allow tourist visitation. But the dome-shelled tortoises, which are found in the highlands, are easy to see. This is on Santa Cruz. There are groups of them in several different places. They love to bathe together. There are different shell types of them. They're now separated in different species. I'm not going to tell you about that. That's part of the DNA work that's been done on the reptiles. They do like to kind of argue with one another. And the same is true of the other organisms. The land iguanas, these are marine iguanas, have also been split off. So there's a lot of active taxonomic work going on in the Galapagos based on mostly molecular studies. These are the famous marine iguanas. This is at Punta Espinosa, excuse me, on Fernandina. But they're found all through the islands. They're abundant. You can't go there without seeing them. And some of them are very, very colorful. This is the group that live on Española. I wish I had time to tell you all about them. This is the model for Godzilla, incidentally. We put a marine iguana on the cover of our book because I've always wanted Godzilla on the cover of one of my books. And in fact, if you see the very first Godzilla movie, you'll see a marine iguana swimming, then an atomic explosion, and next thing you know, you get a giant lizard flattening Tokyo. So marine iguanas have made it to the movies, but so have land iguanas. Darwin was fascinated by both species and studied them at length. This is a land iguana, and this is another land iguana. They are variable from island to island. This one is very different from most of the rest because it has this yellowish color. It's the Santa Fe land iguana, different species. This is a different species from the one you just saw. There are 9 endemic species of lava lizards on various islands. So that's another source of endemism of the animals. All lava lizards have females that have bright orange throats and heads, and that's a female lava lizard. Both of these lovely lava lizards were from Española. And then there are the sea lions. This used to be called the California sea lion. It's a baby. Isn't it cute? Now it's called the Galapagos sea lion. There's enough genetic distinction that it is separated out. And the sea lions don't have external ears. They are built for swimming, and the males are very large. I wish I could tell you a little more about them. And this is a Galapagos fur seal. This is the second species of pinniped that you see on the Galapagos. These are much less commonly seen, but they're abundant enough. They simply stay out of sight. They don't like to be out during the day because they have this thick fur on them. Little armies of crabs, the so-called Sally Lightfoots, they're everywhere. That crab is not endemic to the Galapagos. It's found in a bunch of other places. And there are fiddler crabs, not fiddler crabs, ghost crabs as well. And yes, there are fiddler crabs in the right places, but this is a ghost crab. Birds, here we go. We're going to birds now from now on. Take a deep breath, rest easy. You're going to see birds. This is one of the most beautiful gulls in the world. This is the swallow-tailed gull. It's an amazing bird. It is a nocturnal gull because in the Galapagos, a lot of things like fish and shrimp come to the surface at night. So the eye of this bird is very large, and they often forage at night, which accounts for the fact that during the day, when you go from island to island, you'll see a lot of these if you go there. They are easy to see. They're usually just sitting around. And this is a baby trying to eat this puked up fish, probably squid combination. They love it. And this is, of course, one of the stellar endemic species of the Galapagos. And the species of gull from which it evolved is still in discussion. No time to really go through that right now. There is an albatross that nests on the Galapagos. You can sometimes see it on the waters around the islands, but This is the waved albatross, named for the undulating patterns on its breast. It's one of the smaller albatrosses. There are about 22,000 pairs of them that nest on Espanola. You can go and visit the colony, and that is one of the most exciting things about going there. They're not quite endemic to the islands because there's a small island off of Ecuador where about a dozen pair of these nests. So technically speaking, they're not endemics, but who cares? They're fascinating, wonderful, amazing birds. And you can, depending on what month you're there, watch the courtship, you can watch the nesting behavior, you can watch them feeding young. It is simply way cool. And you're going to say, oh, look at this guy. He's unethical. Look at how close he got to that bird. The bird didn't care, and I wasn't that close. I'm using a 400 millimeter lens with a tele extender. So nobody bothers any of the wildlife in the Galapagos. It simply isn't done. It would be a major ethical infraction. But the nice thing is, if you go with really good camera equipment, mind you, cell phones will work too, but you can get wonderful images. There are 3 species of boobies on the Galapagos. One that looks a little bit like a gannet, the Nazca booby. It's closely related to the masked booby that is widely distributed. Then there's the blue-footed booby and the red-footed booby. None of these are endemic to the Galapagos, not even the Nazca. I think that's found in other islands as well. But they are all abundant enough that you'll see them, and you can watch their courtship behavior. It's very enjoyable. Here is a Nazca booby flying along, and 2 Nazca boobies. You can see why they're derived from a species called the masked booby. They have this black mask around their face. There are 2 color morphs of the red-footed booby, the brown morph and the white morph. And the red-footed booby is the only one that doesn't nest on the ground. The other 2 booby species, Nazca and blue-footed, nest on the ground. Probably more people have watched the courtship of the blue-footed booby, and incidentally, the word booby, which seems a little weird, probably comes from the Spanish word bobo, which means clown. And when you look at these boobies performing, you sort of get the idea, but it's not clowning around. There are a lot of boobies. They're doing this for sex, and they're doing this for pair bonding, and it works. I wish I could show you more of this sequence, but I want to talk about the land birds more. This is a female frigate bird, and this is from Genovesa. It's a young frigate bird. And this is a male great frigate bird with the pouch expanded. Frigate birds are very aggressive. They attack boobies, they attack tropic birds. That's what they do. They're like the Jaegers of the tropics. They attack also this bird, which is the red-billed tropic bird. These nest along Genovesa, and you can get very nice looks at them. When you look at the great frigate bird, you can see that on the back you have green. That green is the iridescent feathers. If that were a magnificent frigate bird, they would be blue iridescence. American flamingos are present on a number of places, particularly Floriana Island and a saline lagoon. It's really cool to be able to see flamingos, hop in a panga, ride a little distance, and see penguins. And there they are. This is the northernmost species of penguin, the Galapagos penguin. These actually cross north of the equator. Some of them nest just north of the equator, so they're the only penguin species to nest north of the equator. They don't seem too impressed by that, incidentally. And they're not as abundant as they once were. They're in danger if there is a degradation of the oceans around the Galapagos, but for now, there they are. One of the animals Darwin apparently never saw, although he was where they occur, is the giant cormorant here. It's not called the giant cormorant, but it's darned large. It's called the flightless cormorant because it doesn't have wings large enough to fly. And why would it evolve flightlessness on the Galapagos, for heaven's sakes? And the answer to that, as Darwin and others have postulated, is that cormorants are shallow water divers. And there's only shallow water around the islands. If these things were to be blown off the islands in flight, they'd be stranded in the Pacific Ocean, nowhere near where they could really get food unless they could do it at night near the surface. So they have gone flightless long time ago. This is a lava heron. People argue about whether this should be speciated or not, or whether it's a subspecies of the striated heron, which also occurs there relative to the green heron. Bird called the lava gull that looks like a laughing gull stuck in a chimney. And that may be the origin of the lava gull, laughing gull. Yes, American oyster catchers. They don't look much different from what we see around here. Well, you don't see them out there in Hampshire, but along the coast of Massachusetts. But that is the American oyster catcher. And one of the most widespread birds in the world, the ruddy turnstone. Obviously, American oyster catchers and ruddy turnstones are not endemic birds to the Galapagos. The lava heron is, the lava gull is, but shorebirds are wide ranging. And there's a long list of shorebirds that have been seen on the Galapagos. And I've recently heard that a group of bird watchers visited the Galapagos and probably didn't study. And they really got on the guide's case because they said, look, you gave us a list. There's all these shorebirds on the list. Where are they? And those are the shorebirds that have collectively been seen on the Galapagos over the years as really vagrant birds. But there is a vagrant list of the Galapagos that brings the list up pretty high, but the number of endemic species of birds on the Galapagos is only barely over 30, and then you add to that the regular ones, and this wandering Tatler is a regular visitor to the Galapagos. It's not a particularly rare bird. Most people see them when they go there, as well as Hudsonian godwit and various excuse me, not Hudsonian godwit, Wimbrel, and various other birds. Great blue heron is the same species we see in Massachusetts. Brown pelican is the same species we see in Massachusetts when they get here occasionally. But if you go to Fort Lauderdale, you see black and brown pelicans galore. Now, you might look at that and say, geez, I've seen a lot of brown pelicans in Florida. That one looks a little bit different. Yeah, it does look a little bit different, but it hasn't been speciated yet. It's still Pelecanus occidentalis, but it's a particular subspecies. A lot of Galapagos populations of birds are given their own subspecies. So I share this with you, ladies and gentlemen. This is Pelecanus occidentalis urani. Why they named it that, I did not know, but you can look up the origin of that if you want. You might have noticed that the lava gull is dark. You might have noticed that the lava heron is dark. This is a short-eared owl. Short-eared owls and barn owls occur on the Galapagos, and they are darker than the ones that are generally seen outside of the islands. So, and this particular one was in a storm petrel colony on Genovesa. The short-eared owls make short work of the thousands and thousands of storm petrels that nest in this island. They have a pretty easy time of it. One of the most beautiful endemics of the island is the Galapagos dove, probably a close relative of the Zenaida dove that is found throughout the Caribbean. But these doves are on many of the islands. They're great flyers, so they don't get isolated. They don't speciate on various islands because they cross islands very easily. The Galapagos hawk is one that got Darwin's interest. He didn't shoot one to get a specimen. He simply whacked it with a stick because they are so tame. They're not quite that tame now, but they were just, actually, the short-eared owl was. We had a short-eared owl sitting out on a trail marker, and we didn't know what to do. We thought, well, should we wait? And the guide said, no, you can walk right past it. Just whatever you do, don't walk and don't reach out to touch it, but just walk past it. Never moved. Seemed perfectly content there. So this is the Galapagos hawk, obviously a buteo. That shape should be suggestive to you. Was wondering, where did this hawk come from? What was the species that gave rise to the Galapagos hawk? Turns out it's the Swainson's hawk, which has a large migration to South America. And the DNA of a Swainson's hawk matches closely the DNA of the Galapagos hawk. So that speculation has pretty much been put to rest. It seems like this is a derivative of the Swainson's hawk. There's a great deal about Darwin and the Galapagos that's intertwined. And if you're actually interested in getting to know it, these two volumes, both written by Janet Brown, the one on the left about Darwin's early life and his visit to the Galapagos and the other places he went to on his Beagle voyage, and then his later life and his work on evolutionary biology. These are the two best biographies going. Any other one isn't as good. Let's start with mockingbirds, and we're going to now integrate Charles a little bit more into the discussion. Well, just lecture. This is the mockingbird you see in Chile. Appropriately enough, it's called the Chilean mockingbird. Now, you've got to learn something about Darwin right now, and this is something we teachers like to keep an eye out. I taught for 48 years at Wheaton College, so I had a lot of students. Some of them were particularly talented intellectually. And one of the things we sort of think we know about young people is their most creative years, their most years of curiosity are when they are young. And Darwin was in his 20s when he went to the Galapagos. His mind was very fertile. And he was in Chile for a long time. He saw an earthquake in Chile before he went to the Galapagos, and he knew mockingbirds. There are about 7 species in South America, but he saw the Chilean very well. And he realized, he said, this is a generalist. It's in a lot of different habitats. It does a lot of different things. And then he got to the Galapagos, and what did he find? Well, the first place he landed, I might have said San Cristobal, but it was actually Santiago, which at that time was called James Island. He spent some days there, and he saw this. This is the Galapagos mockingbird. He recognized immediately that it didn't look like the one exactly that was in Chile, and it raised his interest. He was curious, and he asked questions. And he said, why should this bird, which is only 600 miles from the coast of South America, look a bit different from the one I saw in South America? What's that about? And this is pretty widely distributed. The Galapagos mockingbird can be seen on a lot of islands. Here's another look at it, pretty easy to identify. Has that black around the face. These are very, very confiding birds. They'll fly right up to you. And here's one feeding its young, but this one doesn't look like it. Here's another mockingbird. And Charles Darwin spent time on Charles Island, which is now called Floriana, and he saw this mockingbird, the Floriana, now called the Floriana mockingbird. Now, you can't see it on Floriana anymore. They've been extirpated from Floriana. But there are a couple of small islands near Floriana where they are successful breeders. And so you can see them there. And you'll notice that the plumage of this bird is a bit different from the other one. And again, Darwin said, wait a minute, these islands are pretty close together. Why are these mockingbirds from island to island looking different? This is all, and you only see these on these little islets of Champion and Gardner Island. You can see these very well when you go there, but you can't go there on foot. You sit in your panga, and the mockingbirds are simply flying around. You don't go on land. You can see them from the boat. So then Darwin visited Chatham Island, now San Cristobal, and he looked at this one and he said, That's another one. It doesn't look the same. 3 mockingbirds in this one little archipelago. What is that about? When I went and traveled all these miles in Chile and saw the same mockingbird everywhere I went. So here's the Chatham or San Cristobal mockingbird right there. It's paler than the other one is. Very easy to separate. So these are the 3 mockingbirds that Darwin saw. Floriana, the one that's found in many islands, the Galapagos mockingbird, and the one on San Cristobal. He called them the mocking thrushes. That was the term he used for them. If any bird fertilized his mind about evolution, it was these birds, not the finches. This was his Galapagos epiphany, was looking at these mockingbirds. And he wrote in his diary in the Beagle, when they left the islands, he wrote, if these mockingbirds are different species, it certainly puts doubt in the notion that species are immutable. And so it's really, if you don't like evolution, blame the mockingbirds. Don't pin it on the finches. But hey, I like evolution, so I really love the mockingbirds. It would have been great if he had seen this one. They never visited Espanola, but this is the mockingbird to end all mockingbirds. I love this bird. This is the Espanola mockingbird. And they're like little dinosaurs. They don't fly anymore. The bird is evolving flightlessness before your very eyes. Though they fly perfectly well if they have to. But they come right out on the beach when you land on Espanola. They walk right up to you. And there they are. If you want to get a picture of them, you have to work at it because they get too close. He'd say to the photographers, keep your distance. Well, unfortunately, the mockingbirds don't respect that. Here's a guy trying to photograph one of these birds. It's up there in a tree. I call your attention down to the lower right or lower left-hand side of the picture. Look at the lower left-hand side of the picture. There's one of the mockingbirds perched within a few feet of him. They don't care. And so the mockingbirds are an example of a relatively limited adaptive radiation. And it's the finches that are really the example of a dramatic adaptive radiation, which is still ongoing. Darwin collected finches, but he was sloppy about it. He shot finches, made a collection of them, but he forgot to write down what island each finch was taken from. And he realized that was a serious omission when he got back to England. More about that in a moment. Finches are abundant. You can't miss them. They're not what you would call fancy like hummingbirds, but they are there. And they look a little bit like fledglings in some cases because they have short little round wings, short tails, and when they fly, they kind of buzz along. What you're seeing here are 2 juvenile ground finches, small-billed ground finches. And you know there are 2 juveniles because they have yellow bills. The juveniles have carotenoid pigments in their bills and when they're fed, and the bills turn yellow, but they turn black as the birds mature. Most of the Galapagos finches have black beaks. So when you see one with a really bright yellow beak, you know it's a generally immature bird. The small ground finch is the most abundant finch on the islands, found on it pretty much all the islands. There's a young one. So from island to island, there's not much variation in them. So you have groups of finches. You have a group called the warbler finches that you'll see, a group called the tree finches, where there are some derivative species, and a group called the ground finches. Here's one of the warbler finches, the green warbler finch from Santa Cruz. That's one of the new splits, relatively new splits. And this is the Genovesa ground finch. This used to be called the sharp-beaked ground finch. You notice how sharp that beak is, but the ground finches, the sharp-beaked finches have all been split. And so that adds to the diversity of Darwin's finches. We're just going to go through a few pictures that show you the diversity of the finches. Small ground finches can look slightly different from island to island, because if you have small ground finches on the same island with medium ground finches, their bills will be on average smaller. But if you have small ground finches with no medium ground finches, their bills will average slightly larger. So it's very, very difficult to identify these finches in some cases. If you naively go to the Galapagos and think you're, a hotshot birder and every finch that comes along is going to get a name come hell or high water, you're going to misidentify a few because these things hybridize. That makes matters even more complicated. So as you look at them, you can see the diversity of them, but that diversity for a person like Darwin was a bit overwhelming, methinks. I don't know this for a fact, but as he looked at them, I think he got a kind of, well, they kind of look alike, except for the ones that don't look exactly alike. And the beak characteristics and body size characteristics were really noticeable up to a point. This is Geospiza fortis, the medium ground finch, the one that is the feature player in the great book Beak of the Finch, and the one that's been studied for so many years by Peter and Rosemary Grant on Daphne major. You'll see them in the middle. So here you have the gray warbler finch split off from the green warbler finch, the Espanola cactus finch with a big honker of a bill. You see that's a young one, was beginning to turn black on the beak. This one's a little bit older. And yes, it is very easy to photograph them with the telephoto lens. You don't have to get close to them at all, but there they are. And so it was this iconic group of birds which has made it into all biology textbooks, and the concept is Darwin really saw the finches as the key to evolution. Maybe not. These are the original Darwin's finches collected by the man himself on the island from the British Museum of Natural History. But when Darwin saw these birds, he thought this one was probably a wren or something. It didn't look like a finch. With this kind of a beak, he thought, well, that looks more like a blackbird. So he wondered if that could possibly be a blackbird. That's a cactus finch. And what Darwin didn't realize, because he wasn't there long enough, is there are a lot of characteristics, vocalizations, egg coloration, nest structure, that is the same in most all of these finches, that unites them together, so to speak. But the beak of the finch is the variable thing that really caught Darwin's attention, but maybe wasn't simple enough for him to sort out. But it was sorted out by this fellow, John Gould, the leading ornithologist in Great Britain at the time, and he was the one who looked at the collection that Darwin brought him, which wasn't Darwin's collection. I have a long chapter in my book about this, and these finches were collected by Robert Fitzroy, the captain of the Beagle. And he wanted to combine his finches with Darwin's, do a joint analysis of the biology of and zoology of the Galapagos, but that never happened. But John Gould used the collection by Robert Fitzroy and said to Darwin, they're all finches. They are all finches. You have brought me a collection of different finches from different islands, some of them on the same island, some of them different islands, but they're all finches. So Darwin started a notebook not long after this. And this was around 1838, after he got back from the Galapagos. He labeled it the Bee Notebook. This is it. And when you flip open the Bee Notebook, you find a rather strange diagram. And this is the famous I think diagram by Charles Darwin. This was the tree of life, the first drawing he made of it. Evolution in Darwinistic terms encompasses two things. It encompasses natural selection, which is the process, and it encompasses the tree of life, which is the result. And the result is that you can have organisms branching out from other organisms, and then organisms branching from that branch. And so he wrote these words, his writing isn't very easy to understand, but then translated that into this, the only diagram that appears in The Origin of Species, not based on reality, but based on theory. He shows A to L, which are ancestral species at the bottom. Those various lines are units of time, and those are genealogies. In the case of the species F, it never changes through time. In the case of species A, it gives rise to a whole tree of new species. And this is how it's applied to the Galapagos finches, the Darwin's finches. An old diagram that doesn't encompass the diversity of them that is now recognized, but this is the tree of life as applied to the finches, can be applied to the mockingbirds, can be applied to the land iguanas. And the person who did the most to publicize the notion of Darwin's finches was the great British ornithologist David Lack. And David Lack visited the Galapagos in the late 1930s. That was a bad time, World War II. Didn't like the Galapagos one bit, didn't like staying there. Went back again for a second trip some years later after the war ended, and really had his epiphany on the Galapagos about the finches, and realized that they really were a representative of the tree of life. And you can see the range of diversification of the finches, the cactus finches, the tree finches, a bird called the mangrove finch. This is, oh, I must tell you birders something. One of the things that I see more and more on Facebook is just got back from such and such, saw all the endemics. Oh, good, beat your chest. Congratulations. Well, if you go to the Galapagos, you aren't going to see all the endemics. You're not allowed to see the mangrove finch. It's such an endangered species that no one visits. Ecuador allows no one to go near the mangrove finches. There's also a split in the sharp-beaked ground finch that you won't see called the vampire finch. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. You can't go there either. It's in two distant islands, Darwin and Wolf Islands, and nobody goes there. So there's no way to go to the Galapagos and see all the endemics of the birds. Can't happen, you're not allowed to. So one of the Darwin's finches isn't on the Galapagos. That's the Cocos Island finch up at the top, which is on Cocos Island off of the coast of Costa Rica. I think Cocos Island was one of the models for Jurassic Park Island. These are just various examples of diagrams showing the diversification of the finches. And what you see here is the range of beak size for the small ground finch on one of the islands. Here's another island where small ground finch doesn't occur, but medium ground finch occurs. That's the range of bill size for it, the second one up from the bottom. The third one up from the bottom is when the two species occupy the same island. You can see that the small beak ground finch has on average a very small beak, and the medium ground finch trends, if anything, toward a larger beak. Finally, when you get to the top two, and you have three species of finches on an island, you can see a wide separation in beak size, but a range of beak size. And remember, they can hybridize. They sometimes do. These are the people who are the modern Darwins. That's Rosemary Grant on the right, Peter Grant on the left, husband and wife from Princeton University, did amazing work over the years with a great many students and scholars on Daphne Major Island. Daphne Major is where that circle is. You can see the name and a little arrow pointing up to a dot. That's Daphne Major Island. And the Grants have done several books explaining the complexity of finch evolution using this species. This is the medium ground finch, which is the only ground finch to occur on Daphne Major, so it can be watched very carefully. And it eats pretty hard seeds if it's got a big enough beak to crack them. And not all the medium ground finches have a big beak because it's the only finch there. So they have a range of beak sizes. This is the genus Tribulus. which has these spikes on the seeds, but some of these finches can crack them. And when there are particularly dry years, tribulus is often the only species of plant to produce seeds. And so what happens where you can see those dry year arrows is that the size of the beak in the medium ground finch gets deeper. They are evolving a bigger beak. And if that trend were to continue, the trend toward a bigger beak would continue. But in a wet year, which happens during a severe El Nino, the beak size decreases because lots of the other plants produce seeds, small seeds, and the finches with the smaller beaks have advantages in those years. And so there is an active visual evolution going on. And in order for that to happen, the beak characteristics have to be genetically inheritable. And so the molecular biologists got cracking on that. And sure enough, they are. Found the individual genes, found how they work. In 1994, a book called The Beak of the Finch by Jonathan Weiner was published. It won the Pulitzer Prize. I recommend it. This is what it looks like now. Don't even try, you'll get a headache. It's late at night. But these are the diversification lines of the finches today based on DNA. And in this diagram, you see how complex this can get. And you see it, the islands on the left with the different groups of finches and the subspecies. And on the right, you see the cladogram, as it's called. And down at the bottom, those lines at the bottom are the species most related to the finches that aren't finches. This is the list of finches today. It used to be 13 species of finches that David Lack thought were on the Galapagos. It's 17 species now because of splits. And as I said, the sharp-beaked finch was split into the Genovesa and vampire and sharp-beaked finch. So from one species, you now have three. The warbler finches were split. So from one species, you now have two. And so it goes. The Espanola cactus finch represents a split. So now we're up to 17 species of Darwin's finches that are endemic to the island. And there are really 18 species, including, if you include the Cocos Island finch, which is not on the Galapagos. So they are an enigmatic, fascinating group of birds. I absolutely love watching them when I'm on the islands. This is the vegetarian finch, for instance, one that behaves rather like a parrot. Here's the famous woodpecker finch, which uses tools, breaks off cactus spines. If there were woodpeckers or nuthatches present, this bird wouldn't probably be doing that, because that kind of behavior would be in the province of the woodpeckers and the nuthatches. The warbler, the mangrove finch, and the name tells you where you find those in the mangroves, but that's such a rare bird. There's only one spot in the mangroves on the islands where you can find them. That's heavily protected, and nobody lands there. And these are the sharp-beaked ground finches that they finally decided were worthy of being called vampire finches. So that's their actual common name. And what they do is fly up on the boobies and peck them and make them bleed. And then they lap up the blood. Well, they don't lap it up. They don't have, but they take it in and eat it. They actually eat the blood. And so you might say, well, that makes no sense. Why do they do that? The boobies are infested with hippobossid flies, which are crab-like insects that are among the feathers. And what happens with the vampire finches, they go right up and poke into the feathers and eat the flies. But then they learned they could just eat the boobies, so to speak, eat the booby blood. And so on this one series of islands, that's what they do. So where did these finches come from? Well, they're seed eaters. Anybody who goes to Central and South America should be familiar with those. But there's this thing called the dull-colored grass quit. And then there's this thing, which is the blue-black grass quit. These are the two birds most closely related DNA-wise to Darwin's finches. And in fact, the blue-black grass quit even does courtship rather like Darwin's finches. But related to these are these: the shining honey creeper, the green honey creeper, the masked crimson tanager. In fact, the Darwin's finches DNA now puts them in the family, get a grip, Theropidae, 383 species of tanagers on the IOC list. And now the Galapagos finches are included among them. Am I a tanager? I am a tanager. Well, yeah, you're sort of a tanager, at least for now, because this genetic stuff is a work in progress. And it has strong conservation implications, because as you do more and more splitting of species, you confer on them that magic honor of being a species, which confers on them the idea that they should be preserved and protected. And so there's a lot of stuff going on in taxonomy now on the Enchanted Isles. I hope all of you get a chance to visit the Galapagos Islands. They are just magic. And I really give strong marks to the government of Ecuador for doing what it does to preserve the islands. This is the Espanola mockingbird probing a backpack to see if it's got anything in it of interest. It's a great place. I have been there only 4 times, but those 4 times got me to pretty much all the islands that, except for some isolated ones. So I salute Charles Darwin for what he did and for how he made the most of his time on the Galapagos. I've only given you the very tip of that iceberg, but it's a magical place. It will be preserved, and even though there are a lot of tourists that go there, it is very, very well managed. So on that, I'm going to stop the share and go back to you folks. And whatever amount of time you want to spend asking questions, you may. I am open to questions, comments, cries of moral outrage.
So thank you, John. Excellent talk. We have a couple of questions that have been put in the chat so far. We'll start with those. I have a couple of questions of my own I might throw in, and
Yes.
anyone else who has additional questions, go ahead and post them in chat, and we'll let our speaker address them. So first one that came up from Sophia asked about avian flu, whether it's affected Galapagos pelicans, or, in general, kind of the Galapagos and infectious bird diseases. Are they an issue out there?
The main issue on the Galapagos is invasive species, and that includes species that carry diseases. There is a fly that has is causing a great deal of trouble to some of the Darwin's finches right now. I don't know the answer with regard to the pelicans. I think the population is still doing fine there, but we like to describe the islands as they're always going to be in intensive care, because the biggest threat to the Galapagos right now, there are 2 big threats, and that is the possibility of more and more invasive species. And in fact, you have to wash your shoes and make sure that you don't carry one thing from island to island. And the other, of course, is climate change, because if climate change changes the current patterns or the frequency of cold water currents, that's also going to change the islands. There's an expression, nothing good ever lasts, but we're trying to make the Galapagos last.
As I wanted to throw one more, you mentioned the kind of cleaning your shoes and such, which is a habit I remember coming up in when I've spent time in Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of other parallels in the Galapagos and between the Galapagos and Hawaii. One I haven't heard you mention that I remember really distinctly: Hawaii, the islands all have this kind of wet side and dry side phenomenon, where the weather patterns result in a big climate distinction between the 2 sides of the I guess windward and leeward sides of the island. I don't hear much about that in the Galapagos. Is that a thing there, or?
It's not. If it is, it's expressed in a much more subtle way. It's more of an altitudinal thing with the Garrio up at the higher elevations. Hawaii has a different topography from the Galapagos, and it's certainly suffered a unfortunately, much higher extinction rate of the native species, but it has a more adaptive or a more dramatic adaptive radiation of those so-called Hawaiian honey creepers, which of course are finches. Even though the Galapagos finches became tanagers, the Hawaiian honey creepers became finches.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I've heard it suggested that if Darwin had ever seen Hawaii, he would have just lost it with joy over the diversity there. So
He was in a lot of his writing. He during the voyage of the Beagle, he was very happy. He was really welcoming of what he saw. You could tell he was quite content, and he made the most of it. A pretty tough guy.
let's see, we have another question in the chat. This is from, I think this is from our librarian, Henry Lappin. Henry, do you want to ask this one yourself?
Sure. I'm wondering if there's a best time to visit the Galapagos.
The best time to visit is probably starting in about March or April through about end of October. What happens is that you can, it's a very pleasant season. It's Garrioa season, so you can see most of the things you want to see. The albatrosses actually leave and go to sea over December, January, February, so you won't see them unless you see them, at sea. So that's the best time to go. If you look at when the tours go, it tends to be spring, summer, fall. Darwin was there in the fall. He saw plenty.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. I had a couple of others of my questions, and anybody else out there who wants to. I'm seeing several compliments and praise coming in through the chat window, but not as many more questions. So
well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it.
I'll throw one or two of more of mine in and give other people chances, a little time to add theirs. You had mentioned these lava lizards in the Galapagos, and that the females were very brightly colored.
Well, they have bright colored throats, yes.
Yeah, and you didn't say much about the males, and I'm curious, is this something like with phalaropes where they have a mating system that the females are
No, I don't think it's female dominated mating system. It just is that the females haven't diverged as much as the males have from island to island. There are 7 species, all endemic, of course, to the islands, and you have to go to quite a few, well, at least 7 different islands. I don't think there are 2 species on the same island. I'm not sure. But the males differ in body size and intensity of pigmentation. So some islands have very light colored small males. The one I showed you is a pretty dramatically colored male and a fairly large husky one from Hispaniola.
Okay. Interesting. I've got kind of another sort of more general lizard-based question, and say I read Beak of the Finch, and it seems like I should know the answer to this one from there, but it was a while ago, and my memory's fuzzy. But anyway, so there's a professor named Jonathan Losos who studied diversification of lizards in the Caribbean, and noted the kind of morphology, kind of convergent evolution from island to island, and how lizards of the same kind of the same shape and size on different islands weren't necessarily related to each other, but the shape and size was based on what order they colonized the island in. That islands with 2 species would have a certain pattern, and when a 3rd species moved in, it would occupy a particular space. And so what the shape and size of a lizard was determined more by what order it arrived in the island in, rather than what it was related to on other islands.
Yeah,
Um,
I
And I'm
know
curious
that.
about the finches and mockingbird. I guess the mockingbirds are mostly one per island, but the finches, is there a similar kind of pattern
There
there?
is no island that has more than one species of mockingbird. That's correct.
Uh-huh. But how about the finches?
Oh, well, that's a whole different story. As I said, you can have several species of finches on an island, and when that happens, you're going to have a pattern where the smaller ones trend to smallness, the medium ones trend to mediumness, and the large ones trend to large. But if you have, if you're absent the medium one, the large ones, they'll have one end of their bell-shaped curve get smaller, and the small ones will have one end of their bell-shaped curve get larger. This phenotypic plasticity, based on their ability to get food, they'll have a different body distribution. One of the things also, I'm not sure it's relevant to the question, but it's beginning to be really important that people realize is that you can have two species that are genetically quite different that look very much alike. We've known about convergent evolution for a long time, and you can have two species that look very much alike that are quite different in genetics and need to be split. And that's one of the things that molecular biology sometimes takes a different track from morphology in designating species. It's tricky. Think of red poles.
No, I try to think of them, but not too deep, not too much. So, all right, I see our audience size is starting to dwindle a bit. I think
Well,
maybe
it's
we'll
getting to
turn
be,
things
you
onto
know,
reptiles. I
bedtime.
may have driven away a lot of the more bird-oriented
A
people.
lot of people have already left for Maine.
Yeah, there's that
If I
too.
drive all night, I can be there, and they'll be sitting right out in the middle of the road. Right? Don't run over it.
Hey, John, I had one question for you, John.
Yeah.
You had mentioned about Champion and Gardner Island,
Mhm.
that you don't land there, but you took your Panga up and you're able to view one of the endemic mockingbirds,
Yeah, you can do the Floriana mockingbird.
the Floriana mockingbird. Okay, is that the only place where they can be seen, or?
Bingo. But
Okay.
they're easy to see. I'll tell you a secret about that. You go up there, and most of the time you just look around on the cactuses and you see them up there. And then it's an idea. Then it's sort of wrestling on the panga to get a good angle to see them with your binoculars or with your camera, whatever you want to do. But if you just go, they'll come close.
Yeah. Okay.
They don't mind. So almost everybody sees them when they go there. But you'll notice that there are people that do go onto the island, and these are researchers. Some of those mockingbirds are color banded, and so they're being studied for longevity and the usual things demographically that ornithologists study birds for.
Okay, great. Now, is Gardner and Champion Island, are they like a smaller island off of one of the larger ones?
Yeah, those are just off of Floriana.
Floriana. Okay, great. Thank you, John.
Okay.
Yeah, Steve, you said you're going to the Galapagos this summer?
We are, yeah. In June, we're going to be going on a 8-day cruise around the islands, and yeah, we're pretty excited.
You'll love it.
Is it? Yeah, are you going with like an ecotourism, like a nature-based company, or is it like a more general cruise and you're kind of tacking the nature on yourselves?
It's a eco tour.
Yeah,
Who's
the
it?
company's called Adventure Life,
Adventure Life.
and we're going on a boat called the Montserrat.
The Montserrat.
Well, the only thing I can tell you is that I've never been on a tour. Well, one of the tours I did was arranged. We did it ourselves. We got a group of friends and arranged it ourselves. But some of them are such that if it's not that the guides don't know the distinctions among the birds, but if they sense that the people are not that interested in knowing those distinctions, not knowing whether it's a medium ground finch or a small ground finch. They'll just pass over it, and
Okay.
because they've got all sorts of things to tell you. So to the degree that you can study ahead of time and sort of come with a prepared mind, and boy, have I got the book for you.
Yeah.
But in any case, that's one of the things that does happen, is that the guides, part of a guide's duty is to assess the clientele. And sometimes it gets a little overstimulated with birders who want to see every single bird species there. And if that's the case, hopefully they're in a group of primarily birders, and then the guides can do their best to make that happen. But if you're just with a generalized group of folks, you'll walk past a lot of Darwin's finches without the guide trying to identify them. He'll just say there are probably two species here, small ground finch, medium ground finch. And when you go up into the highlands, you're not going to make a special effort to see woodpecker finch or tree finch or something like that. It's just whatever comes along. Unfortunately, woodpecker finch is pretty common, and so are the at least the small tree finches.
What was that book that you recommend?
Mine. It's
Oh, your
called-
book. Okay.
Nice.
Well, oh no, it seriously, I mean this. You know, I love people who are modest, but this is the only book that really goes into the natural history of these things. Most of the books are identification guides. There are great books on identification of Galapagos plants and animals, but they don't much go beyond the identification. And if you want to get some of the if you want to know about the sex life of the flightless cormorant, for example, which is fascinating, I don't know of any book other than ours that really details it.
And
But
John,
there is a problem, and that is our book weighs 4.5 pounds. So it's not an easy one to carry around in the field. It's not meant to be a field guide.
Yeah, John, your book, I think you mentioned you and Kevin both lead tours for Wildside on the.
Well, I don't lead tours for Wildside. I sometimes
don't?
go with Kevin as a co-leader, but Kevin is the man. I mean, he's done over 40 tours.
Mm-hmm. So, and some of that knowledge from the tours is worked into the book of where to go and how to get there.
What Kevin did, most of the text, the vast majority of it, I wrote and revised. But Kevin also worked very hard on the landing sites. We have a great chapter on all the landing sites. So it's the last chapter, and you can go to any island and see all the landing sites and what to expect if you go on those landing sites. Not only what you're going to see, but what the level of difficulty is in getting around.
Oh, perfect.
Mhm.
And John,
the other thing that you got to do when you're on the Galapagos has nothing to do with birds is get wet. Put on a wetsuit and get into the water and look at these gorgeous fish. And and you can swim with the penguins.
What about with the iguanas? Can you swim with the iguanas?
Yeah, I've done, it's real cold water where they let you do that. So you've got to have and they don't care. The male iguanas are larger, and they will go on further foraging expeditions than the female and small young ones. So if you get out to where there's maybe 15, 20 feet of water off of the areas where the iguanas are, you'll see the male iguanas foraging on the algae. Cool.
That's awesome. John, what was the name of your book again?
It's called Galapagos, A Natural History.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Published by Princeton University Press. They do a great job on publishing nature books.
All right. Well,
It's been a pleasure. Thank you all.
It has been a pleasure. I have to admit, I'm kind of disappointed we didn't get you in for an in-person talk, and we had to do Zoom. But maybe in person will happen again in a few years. And
It could be. We'll hope that that's the case.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you much. I'll be in touch by email to wrap up a couple things, John.
Okay, it's been a great pleasure, and I saw the attendance was very nice, so I appreciate that. Zoom is
until I started
everybody.
talking, then it went down.
Thank you, John.
Okay, I'm going to leave. Adios,
Okay.
amigos.
Good night. Good night,
Good
everybody
night.
who's left. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Josh.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Everybody's leaving.
Where's the-